Al. Well done, Derek.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Robin. I don't see Robin very often, and you know, he's very old now, so I thought perhaps he was going to be failing when we met. So I thought what I'd do is I'd include some cartoons in my presentation today so that you could understand it very simply, and that it might make him laugh. It's a relief to know that he doesn't need a hearing aid, and I take it you don't need any wet wipes yet either, Mr. Page, do you? Okay, so it's all looking good. So at the end of it all, I mean, the presentation I'm going to give is really, you know, in support of what you've already heard. For those of you who have grandchildren, and maybe those of you who still have children who have an age, you know, who watch kids' cartoons, you'll know the Lorax. And the idea that these little people live in this happy world that's all plasticized, where there are artificial trees and artificial flowers, and it's all jolly, jolly, and people are selling you air because you have to buy it. There's no other option. And it doesn't seem absurd, and it's not until somebody looks at the edge of the world and runs a wee digger through it and part of the wall falls down that people walk to the edge and look at it and think, oh, actually, it's not quite as jolly as we thought it was. I've worked with water voles since the early 1990s. I started work with them at a time when we knew nothing about the captive reproduction, and also we knew little about their nature conservation. We knew in the early 1990s that it was believed that this animal, which had once been a very common animal, had declined from being a familiar animal of the wider landscape by somewhere in the region of 60 to 70%. A follow-up survey that was done in the mid-1990s suggested that the decline hadn't been a decline to one of 70%, and actually been a decline of somewhere in the region of 92%. And every survey of the species nationally that's moved on from these original surveys in the early 1990s has shown us steadily that despite what we've learned about effective mink control from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, or effective habitat management, or some of the wonderful behavioural understandings that have come from Aberdeen University, that the situation has got steadily worse. When I began, or when the original biological action plan for the species was put together in 2002, it predicted a national population of approximately 1.2 million. And when you talk about voles, and you say how much you love them and how important they are as the base of a food chain, this animal is 11 times the weight of a male field vole. You lose this from a landscape, and it's not an exercise in nostalgia. We're not saving Ratty and his little chum, the mole, for the next jaunt up and down the Windrush, smoking his fore and aft, smoking his pipe and wearing his fore and aft hat. What we're doing is we're saving food. You're right, we're saving food. But now the estimated national population, as of last year, is 200,000 animals. It's failing, and it's failing badly. And it's failing badly despite the understandings we have. If we're not very careful, we now face a future where so many animals we were once familiar with are not going to be brown and furry and breathing and sentient. They are going to be black and white photographs in an encyclopedia that people might take off a shelf 100 years from now and dust down, or they might not bother to do so at all because they're so gone, they're so distant, they're so forgotten that they just don't understand they were ever there. The battle we've had with wildlife on this island is not one we've lost over the course of the last 50 years. Since we became a dominant land force on the British Isles with no land bridge, basically we have eliminated species after species. We can no longer talk about ecosystems in this island. There's no such thing as an ecosystem here. What you've got the edges of a cobweb blowing and what's left of the sunlight coming through the dusty light of an old window. The big carnivores are gone. The big herbivores are gone. And now we're worrying about the little animals, the tiny things that are falling off the shelf that we desperately wish to save and sustain. But we're finding that even that's beyond us. It is a tragedy that when you look at the cost of restoring something like the white-tailed sea eagle or the golden eagle, trying to expand their range, that there are still lines on the map that these birds can't cross, because if they do, they're wiped out by people who view them with a medieval mindset and a medieval mentality. It's wrong. Today, The Royal Danish Foundation for Wildlife have announced that they're starting a consultation process which will see ultimately, hopefully, the return of the white-tailed eagle to the Channel coast, to the Isle of Wight, hunting in a landscape where those birds have not hunted in 250 years. We can't live with large herbivores on this island. There are too many roads. They're dangerous. Rewilding is a great idea, it's a great concept, until you hit a moose and a mini, maybe on one of the major Scandinavian road networks, and it kills you, your wife, and your children, and most of the people in the cars that are coming towards you. The world over, it's not an African situation. The world over, the big animals, the animals that need space to survive, are all being hemmed in by fences or barriers if they don't exist on islands and peninsulas. We need more NEPs. For those of you who haven't been, the corridors we've described, and the corridors I'll come back to, are incredibly important. We've made the landscape the way it looks. We've taken it over the course of the last 50 years and created a wasteland, created a desert through which not much can move at all. But what we need to do now is look at the scale of the challenges that face us, and we need new ideas and new concepts. We need maybe more nature dynamos where nature takes over, where cattle graze under the trees, where scrub reforms, where you have mycorrhizal fungi, and then you have the kind of excellent farming systems you've just described, so that the turtle doves that come here to feed in the residue rooting of the pigs actually have somewhere to breed in when they fly out and over the edge of the fence. We need corridors. We sit here and we talk about corridors now. 25 years ago, the Dutch and the Germans were talking about corridors. Old military corridors through the landscape where the border fences had been taken away when the empire in the east fell. Corridors that they were creating to buy up the last of the biodiverse areas so that animals that were small, animals and birds that could fly, could move through landscapes that were so formidable that when they entered them, there was no food, there was no cover, there was no opportunity of making a life. Captive breeding. When I started with water voles, it was an irrelevance. It was something that was a side game. It wasn't that important. We were going to kill mink. We were going to create corridors. But corridors are only good if the animals and the birds and the other species you wish to see in them still survive. When we talk about this old war with nature, we've not just eradicated living space for the common frog, we've eradicated whole species. From archaeological sites, from excavations of the fens, we know there was a much broader guild of amphibians, that there were tree frogs here, moor frogs, agile frogs, water frogs, a whole guild of species, the voice and calls of which we've now silenced, effectively and emphatically. So if we're really serious about restoring this landscape and restoring life and food and a prey base, we have to think back further, and we need to think again about how simple this is all going to be. Because we're in a third world situation. This is not down to just tiddling around with edges. In part it is, but it's also going to be a case of reaching out to grab the last desperate remnants of what there is, so we can take it, breed it, make it bigger, make it stronger, and one day release it. In the time I've worked with them, I bred somewhere in the region of 22,000 water voles with the able and capable people who've helped me to do this. That now equates to approximately 10% of the wild living population that is left. But we're still losing this animal. We're still losing its place in time. And it doesn't just apply to terrestrial mammals. You talked earlier on about birds going back to where they come from. Time and time again, we realize it's not just down to providing space, that there are greater complexities in the animal's behavioral patterns. You know, last year, for the first time ever, the population of bar-tailed godwits that is breeding in the Neen washes were double clutched. So that when this wetland flooded in this limited landscape where they survive in a pocket, the first clutch could be taken, the birds reared in captivity, the birds lay another clutch to try and double the reproductive population of godwits in a single year. James is not here, but I come from Dartmoor. I farm on the edge of Dartmoor. And the last pair of curlews finished there this spring. Female dead, male on its own. The birds that come by are the 20, 30-year-old birds that were born in the calm, that come back to a landscape which they can't occupy, where no other curlews exist, where there is no prospect of them breeding, within the next 5 to probably not even as long as that, within the next 2 or 3 years, those birds will die, and that will be the end. That's where we are. And we need this animal so much. I am sure that you're all sitting here looking at it and thinking, beavers, they cut down trees. They're a pain in the arse. They block up sewage outflows. Yes, they are. In a landscape like ours, it's like trying to live with a teenage child with Tourette's syndrome. They can be a real trial. They're just going to get you. They're going to do the most bizarre things. They'll have a whole river full of trees that are adapted to them, trees that have lived with them for 40 million years. And yet they'll come out of that river, walk into a public park, and cut down an ornamental cherry that was planted 30 years ago to honor a mayor or somebody's dog. And in the end, it's just that kind of irritation that gets us. But these animals are a force of nature. We talk about keystone species. They're not a keystone species. They're something that when you put in a landscape, it turns landscape back. They basically hold water, and in the wetlands you have the richest living repositories of life there are on this planet. So you take the corner of this little field, you drown the plantation, the water voles come back, the ducks come back, stoats hunt them through the galleries above them. A whole myriad of life starts to reform around the beaver. We don't have time to go into this in detail tonight, but just understand an 80% greater biomass of insects, an 80% greater biomass of frogs, and as soon as you start to see the building blocks reform of those prey gills, then all other life moves in to meet them. Yes, they're a challenge. Yes, they're a pain. But you cannot expect people like Tony, as Tony illustrated so ably just a short while ago in Africa, to tolerate animals that kill you and flatten your house and eat all your crops in 45 minutes. When we're not going to let an animal that takes a few willow trees down that are worth nothing and makes a wetland on the edge of our farm live at all. And also we know they are great generators of natural flow control. So the economic argument for the return of the beaver has been made very solidly by Exeter University. And we know that they're like a flow valve. When it's too wet, they hold water. When it's too dry, they release it slowly. We need those animals very much. And we need to start to think again about our understanding of species. We talked about corridors, but there are pockets through the British Isles of areas, tiny reserves, cultivated where species like this little lizard survived, the sand lizard, which would have perished and died, this brilliant emerald jewel. It would have gone 30 years ago if it hadn't been for a dedicated bunch of people like Martin Noble who took them in, captive bred them and released them. We think of it as a delicate, fragile species of heathland and coastal sand dune systems. You go to beaver-generated landscapes in Bavaria, they're sitting on top of the dams, acting like little marine iguanas. When they're disturbed, they swim away underwater, and then they pop up on a floating piece of wood out in the middle of the dam system, sit on it, bask, and catch the insects that they basically come to bask as well. We don't understand much of our wildlife that well. The old relationships, the elemental relationships, the old biology, we view it as a sepia-tinted understanding of old farmed landscapes. The relationships behind many of those species with the other animals like beavers that drive them are much older, much deeper, much more profound. Why would we want water frogs? Why is it important to bring back a broader guild of frogs? These are diurnal. They're diurnal, they're active during the day, they always stay by water, they're hugely productive. So if you're a hern or an egret or anything that eats a frog, you need to have these in the environment in huge numbers to feed you. If you have very few, then you have very few of these birds. If you have many, then you have your tree sparrow analogy. Nature is a marvelous thing. As we sit in a time where we've had biological action plans, many of which have failed, and when they've failed as human beings, what we've done? We've moved the goalposts. But nature doesn't like goalposts. It doesn't like plans. If you create areas where nature can live and prosper, nature will come back. This bird, the black stork, was a British species. There's Pleistocene evidence for this bird, and through every age in history, fleetingly it's there. It was persecuted by us for reasons that are absurd. But in Belgium and Germany, where beavers have been restored and they've restored the wetlands that creates feeding space and living space for life, this bird's come back. There are 80 breeding pairs of it in Belgium now. It's going to tip over that channel. It's going to come to Britain, and it's going to find no space and no food. Shrikes. If you think of blackstorks, a big bird that size. A shrike is a very small bird. You read books from the 50s and they'll tell you it's the butcher bird, the bird of scrub and hawthorn and heath. It's a bird that impales its victims on spikes and spurs. At Dartmoor, 3 years ago, 1 breeding pair of red-backed shrikes in the whole of Britain. I was with the girl from the Forestry Commission who's responsible for shrike watch so that people didn't steal their eggs. And then the year that they laid, they reckoned they were going to have to feed them crickets from a pet shop because the weather was so bad and there were so few insects on Dartmoor for a bird that size that the birds couldn't feed their chicks. So, you know, it's just when you start to look at the immensity of the task that faces us, the marvelous work you've done, you've got to consider that this is a fairly massive mountain we still have to climb. But there is hope, because our history of interaction with species in this world shows us quite emphatically when people act, they can do things. This animal, the European bison, from the time of Julius Caesar on, was not a wild animal in Europe. It was parked for hunting. And for 2,000 years it survived because people just made random decisions to keep them. And it nearly perished in the First World War, and it nearly perished in the Second World War. But it's only in the last 20 years that a mature understanding of the importance of this animal as a large woodland browser in the ecology of forests has re-emerged. For 2,000 years, it was kept as a whim. People can change things. But as we've heard from the speakers today, we need to act, we need to move on, we need to put political pressure on politicians to do things. We need to re-engage with communities like the farming community. And we need to look at how we're actually going to take this landscape and reshape it, because what is certain is that if you wait for long enough and that you do nothing for long enough, then in the end you'll get to a stage where nothing much can be done at all. There are challenges that face us. One of the species that we're working on with the assistance of Zach and Ben Goldsmith is this animal. Hunted, snared, harried from England. It was a common English animal, and the reason we didn't want it here was because of the rabbit warrens. The rabbits were valuable, a reason now long gone, and that's why there are no wildcats here anymore. We can do something about that. It will probably survive and recolonize in the way that birds of prey have done. But at the end of it all, this is an animal that's above the Scottish border. It will never come down here naturally. So we want these animals in this landscape. We're going to have to go and get them. We're going to have to breed them. And we're going to have to bring them south to the best of the English deciduous woodlands there are, which are rodent rich. And we're going to have to train them to live here again. It's going to cost money, it's going to take time, it's going to create a new degree of expertise, but it's something we need to do because extinction, we now know, is not something that's distant. It's not something that happened in another country a long time ago that's in a black and white picture that we've chosen to forget about. It's something that's happening here and now in our lifetimes. And we have to act, we have to take responsibility, and we have to do something about this. Thank you very much.